Annie
I love it.
Crowe, wholehearted welcome to you today. We have been talking about chatting and creating a video for our community for a while, so I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you.
Thank you for
Annie
having me.
Crowe, our pleasure. Annie Crowe is a disability rights lawyer and advocacy coach dedicated to empowering neurodivergent and disabled individuals to confidently speak up and have their needs met, enabling them to live safe and fulfilling lives. As the founder and CEO of NeuroAccess, Annie combines legal and advocacy expertise with her lived experience to dismantle barriers to access and inclusion and drive systemic change. Annie is passionate about ensuring that all people who think and feel differently are valued and supported in our world. And I just couldn't love that more. Annie, have I missed anything important?
Oh, no, I think that's a good summary. Not a don't love introductions,
Yeah, I
but
hear
I know
you.
they're
I feel the
important.
same.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
absolutely.
absolutely. I guess maybe the main thing is my main focus, especially these days, a few years into NeuroAccess, is mostly on workplace and leadership inclusion around neurodiversity. But I still sort of dabble in healthcare space,
Mm,
especially mental health care related, which was what
mm,
I sort of started doing
mm,
because I'm so passionate about it. And
mm,
not only have I been deeply affected by it, but also most of my clients have had impacts in these sectors. So that's why I
mm.
still talk about this stuff, even though these days it's probably more focused on workplace stuff.
Well, I would say that it all rippled, they're all intertwined, aren't
They
they?
are,
What you're doing in
for
the
us, certainly.
workplace, yeah, it has a ripple into how we support people with mental health challenges. And I think, I mean, the first time we met and we spoke at length and we were talking about the increase in diagnosis, particularly for women, over, I think it's over 30 or over 40. But we're obviously seeing this increase and some improved awareness. But I think what's so exciting to connect with you today is looking at that and the interplay between how parents are navigating maternity care if they're neurodivergent and how parents are perceived by caregivers if they're neurodivergent, but they're not considering that lens. So I'd be really interested to hear from you. What are some of the key challenges that neurodivergents typically face when
Yeah. So,
navigating maternity care?
well, I mean, it's interesting because, it is becoming more usual to see late diagnosed. We're still about 80% of people leaving, females or AFAB folk leaving school, are still undiagnosed, but it's
Mm,
becoming earlier and earlier, thank goodness, thanks to
mm,
awareness and education and unpacking a lot of bias in the
mm,
DSM and such. But I think this generation is the first generation to be able to go through maternity care and to have quite a number of neurodivergent people be able to say, I'm neurodivergent
mm,
and I have these access needs.
mm,
There's still obviously plenty that go through that are unaware of their neurodivergence. There's
mm,
about 1 in 5. So
mm.
if you thought that you'd rarely get a birthing person that was neurodivergent, then you probably should check your own bias.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
was one of those people who went into my own birth experience with my labels, with my diagnosis, identity, awareness of that. And I guess one of the things that makes me talk in these sectors is that it was just not understood at all by
Mm.
anyone.
And
And
Annie, tell me
so,
how long ago was that? When was your birth
yeah, yeah.
experience?
So
Yeah.
my son just turned 4.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's 4 years now. So it's not that long ago, but
No.
also, not yesterday.
Mm,
But I also, a lot of my clients, a lot of people that come to me through my advocacy work about their own birth trauma experiences and inaccessibility in the maternity care system. But some of the
mm,
key challenges that I see, and some I've experienced myself as well, is probably sensory overwhelm is one of the biggest ones, from bright lights, loud environments, unexpected touch,
mm,
strong smells can really set our nervous system off.
mm,
The communication barriers are a huge one. So, you know, sometimes struggling to process medical jargon or information overload, or having to like fast-paced decision making. And that's
mm,
an interesting one because I actually tried to advocate. I have many of us also have chronic health issues. So I was a high risk pregnancy and had like oversight from early on. But I
mm,
saw the head obstetrician at my public hospital. at my 20-week appointment. And I wanted to talk to him about birthing preferences then because I knew, well, one, I was very likely going to be induced because of my complications.
Mm,
And two, I wanted to have that discussion while I was in a state where I could articulate my needs and not distressed and overwhelmed by everything that happens in the birthing period.
mm,
So, but the reaction I got from that was, we'll talk about it in your third trimester, which is sad. And
mm,
also, when I said I didn't want to use the balloon, how they inflate the balloon in you to help dilation, and because I had a history of sexual assault, and 90% of autistic women do have a history of sexual violence. It's huge.
90%.
90%,
Wow.
yep, is a recent
Okay.
study.
Yeah.
So it's very common. And his response to that was, and this is the head obstetrician, right?
Yeah.
His response to that was, but it's best practice.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
are you
Yeah.
kidding?
Yeah.
So if we're like, I think what a huge challenge that we face, whether we do or don't know that we're neurodivergent, is being able to have these conversations early in our journey, and to a point where when it comes to the birthing experience, we're feeling empowered and safe, and safety is a
Mm,
big one, because if
mm,
we don't feel safe, as we know, birth can go a lot more, it can be a lot more complicated if we're in a state of severe stress.
mm, mm,
But the lack of informed consent is a really big one. So, if we're thinking about, parents need to know what's happening to make informed consent, but if you've got communication differences and sense and processing differences, then that is a gray area in terms of how are you communicating and ensuring that they are informed. So
mm.
using things like sometimes visuals, not just verbal communication, giving time to process, that sort of thing. And another big challenge, I think, is masking and not
Mm.
being believed, and atypical presentation. So I like to use the example that I'm one of the people who is sort of hypersensitive and overreactive. So people think doctors and medical professionals think I'm a hypochondriac,
Yeah. Or you're difficult, a
or I'm
difficult patient.
difficult. Yeah,
Yeah.
even though I
Yeah.
have a really heightened sensitivity to pain. But I've got clients on the opposite end who are hyposensitive and don't express pain,
Mm,
or have like flat affect, and they get dismissed. So one of them went in on she was having her second child, and she had an app, and she's like, I've been checking, contractions are this far apart, they're really strong, blah blah blah. Um, and the midwife at check-in was like, "Oh, sweetie, come back when you have a sweaty upper lip," and turned her away. She walked
mm,
back to the car park and was like, "Nah, this is coming. I know."
mm,
Walked
mm.
back in and gave birth within 5 minutes. Like, not being
Wow.
believed because we have atypical pain responses and interoception challenges is a
Mm,
huge problem. And it can be life death situation,
mm,
because
mm,
a lot of medical professionals take those signs to help make decisions about things. So if you're not aware that you've got someone who has those atypical responses, that can really impact safe treatment and
mm.
safe support.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in what you're saying because there's so
Totally.
many layers. Like when you talk about that not being believed, that is something that shows up in our community again and again, women's experiences being completely invalidated.
I mean, you
But
don't have to
then
be neurodivergent or disabled for that to happen, right? It happens to so many of
exactly.
us
Yeah,
regardless.
yeah. So there's that interplay between just generally, we are not treating people as individuals. We are typically, often I hear, oh, you're a worried first time parent, or, so you're instant, we are the experts on our body and we need to be viewed as that. And that's the challenge. The other thing that I think is really interesting, if we go back a bit in your own personal story, that you were educated. You come from a place of obviously, as a human rights lawyer, you understand what the conversations that you needed to have. So in that regard, you were fortunate that you could actually have those conversations. You asked to have these conversations, but the fact that you were an educated, sorry to say, educated white woman, you were
Totally.
still dismissed in seeking out the
Yeah.
information that you wanted,
Yeah.
and your preferences were still overlooked. And I really appreciate you also talking to experiencing sexual assault. I think we don't actually, when we're, you would have seen in the birth trauma inquiry that in the recommendations, talking about the importance of trauma-informed care, but I think that there is still this lack of education for our care providers to understand why trauma-informed care is so important. And of course, because they're not understanding or perhaps educated about that, then that flows through to parents, because when we look at birth, society still obviously perceives it as the happiest day, it should be the happiest day of your life. It's
Mhm.
quite difficult to kind of think, oh, actually, my prior trauma history may influence that. Like parents just don't know that because we're not taught about it. And I think of a
Totally.
story that I heard literally this week, where the mum had birth preferences not strong. You know, there's can often be this pushback. Oh, women come in expecting too much. All of these birth, this is their birth plan. But even in the terminology birth preferences, this is what I want. And in her experience, she wanted to avoid an instrumental delivery, and she wanted to avoid an induction, and she was pushed to an induction, pushed to an instrumental delivery, and she had stipulated on the birth preferences that she had a prior sexual assault history, all completely overlooked. And that's so you come in educated and you're dismissed, but there's that other layer of people that don't even have that experience and don't have that opportunity. And there's so much more to be done, isn't there?
So much. And I think that, that's one of the things is like I hold so much privilege
Mm,
as a white, educated, middle class woman. And I was still dismissed. And that is what
mm,
really, I guess, shook me because I'd obviously been in the medical system for years at that point with lots of chronic health issues, even though I was relatively newly identified as autistic and ADHD.
mm,
And I guess I thought it would be a lot more straightforward in saying, oh, I have autism, doctor.
mm.
You should
Yeah.
understand what that means. But it
Mm,
wasn't. And that's really what started to fuel my fire for my public advocacy work because, if that was happening to me, it's going to be happening to everyone. Like you
mm,
just,
mm.
and the other thing that happened in my situation on the trauma note is I ended up obviously making a complaint about that obstetrician. And it's actually one of the biggest challenges I see is that neurodivergent people think they deserve support or that their accommodations are like valid and proper, like because most of us have been gaslit our whole lives or dismissed and
Yeah.
invalidated.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
big one. But so I spoke up and made a formal complaint and ended up getting another obstetrician who stayed with me the rest of the pregnancy and was much more empathetic, also female, not that that should matter. But anyway,
Yeah.
and she ended up making sure that I ended up having a planned C-section, but ensuring that the entire C-section staff were female
Mm,
because she knew about my sexual assault history.
mm,
I didn't
mm,
ask for that. I didn't really
mm,
need that, but they had things in place, or at least she knew what to do
mm,
in terms of trying to be, aware and supportive of that. But
mm,
nothing for my neurodivergence. No sensory
mm,
accommodations, no communication accommodations. I mean, I obviously articulated what those were. Sorry,
mm.
my dog is having a minute. Moose, come here.
I can't hear
Oh,
anyway, so
good.
don't
Oh, good.
worry.
He's like scratching at the carpet. He knows when I'm in interviews, he can get away with it. Anyway, so yeah, it's really it it really upset me that
Mm,
they were supportive of the trauma
mm.
and not the neurodivergence and disability. Because
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
how is that a lesser importance thing? Like, yes, trauma is huge and they
Mm,
should be doing that. Like, that's
mm,
great. But being a neurodivergent disabled person is the foundation of everything about my interaction with the world and my experience in
mm,
pregnancy and birth. So the
mm.
fact that they had no clue how to accommodate that or even understand how that impacted me really made me mad. like,
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah. And but
I've
it's
got to
driven
change
you to,
this.
yeah, well, that's it. It's I have the privilege of meeting incredible women like you that go through an experience and go, hang on a minute, something needs to change. And you've talked to you were fortunate enough to get this obstetrician that was able to ensure that your needs were met in terms of possibly with that lens of the sexual assault, which is great to hear. And I haven't heard of other experiences like that. So there needs to be acknowledgement there. But in terms of
Totally.
practical changes that hospitals could do, or maternity care providers could do to implement to make their services more neurodivergent friendly, what would you say could be done, right now, really. Like how,
Yeah.
because I don't think that there is education on this, on actually engaging with neurodivergent parents. I could be
No.
wrong.
Well, I mean, there are a
Yeah.
couple of advocates on social media that are doing great work, but in
Mm,
terms of formal training and education, there still isn't much.
yeah.
So I guess, I mean, there's a lot. And the number
Mm.
one thing would be moving from a one size fits all to individualized care. I think like that will help everyone, let alone,
It is literally everybody. That's
right?
exactly what we want. Yeah.
How is
Yeah.
this not common sense? Anyway, but
Yeah.
let's talk about some practical changes you can start implementing today, or things that you can start to bring to mind if someone comes to you and says, I'm a neurodivergent person, I'm autistic, I'm ADHD, whatever.
Mm.
So let's sensory friendly environments. So thinking about how can I create quiet spaces, maybe dim the lights, minimize unnecessary sensory input. Actually, let's take it
Mm.
back a step. I think the first thing would be to ask the individual what they need. And
Yeah.
that's actually complicated because depending on where they are on their own, self-identification or diagnosed journey can
Mm.
kind of depend on how aware of what their actual support needs are.
Also,
So
you don't know what you don't know,
you don't know.
right? Go,
Yeah.
yeah.
Just like setting
Yeah.
boundaries. I talk about
Yeah.
how like it's hard to set a boundary that hasn't already been breached. Once the boundary is breached, you set that boundary.
Y-
You know it's the thing.
Yeah.
Same
Yeah.
with access needs. So,
Yeah.
but first coming from a place of let me know what you need. So they might be like, I'm sensory sensitive in sound and light, but I can't smell anything or whatever. Or I need visual communication versus verbal. There's lots of different ways that might work for them, and they might already know some of those things. So starting at that point where we're empowering them to be educating us on who they are and
Mm.
what they experience, and then
Hmm.
on top of that building your knowledge around what does sensory friendly environments look like, what does alternative communication look like. So maybe like I said, visual guides, slowing down the pace of verbal communication without infantilizing the person, because that could be a
Mm.
problem.
Mm.
um, Offering written summaries or like follow-up notes, like if they're at a maternity appointment and they need to get anything done or focus on anything before the next appointment, giving it to them on a note in writing rather than making it their responsibility to remember. I mean, that's a
Mm.
huge one around executive functioning challenges, especially with ADHDers. But if you're thinking about like the overwhelm of being in one of those appointments, regardless of in the actual birthing stage, a lot of us also have a lot of communication demands, and we're putting in so much cognitive energy to be able to process what they're saying, to be able to remember what we need to say or ask, that those things can just become harder. So even though we might be organized on a daily basis and have systems in place already,
Mm.
doesn't mean that we don't need support in those areas. And I guess that's another area to kind of unpack in terms of don't assume that because you've got a highly educated professional person in front of you that they are good at all of these things or that
Yeah.
they don't need
Yeah.
support in these things.
Yeah.
If we
Yeah.
start making a lot of these things like that universal design, you're going to help mums who are just stressed in general, let alone your neurodivergent disabled mums, or parents, I should say.
Yeah.
um, so, and yeah, I think another one is like more flexible birth plans and talking about them earlier. So I actually don't like to use birth preferences. I like to say it's my birth advocacy plan because
Yeah.
it is about your preferences, but it's also about your rights and needs. So
Yeah.
preferences kind of disempowers it. Um,
Okay.
I mean, it's not wrong to say that, obviously, but
No, I like where you're thinking with this. That
yeah.
makes sense to me. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and also like there's such a power dynamic in the room when we're giving birth, right? We've got the
Mm.
obstetricians, maybe a midwife, depending on which way you go. You are the least powerful person in that room
Mm. Mm.
because when stuff hits the fan, usually they have to act quite quickly and they can't always get your informed consent in a articulate way, right? And
Mm.
so preparing for that early is so critical. And,
Mm.
that example of my obstetrician dismissing me at 20 weeks, wanting to talk about my birth plan,
Mm.
that it should be normal to be talking about this in your second trimester. Like by third
Hmm.
trimester, I don't know about you, but I was exhausted. I
Yeah.
was like freaking out about the fact that I was about to have to keep a tiny human alive. My
Yeah.
thoughts were like elsewhere, learning about like sleep training and all that weird stuff. Like I like, even though I was obviously preparing for the birth as well, I would have my anxiety and stress and, nervous system would have been a lot more calm if I'd been able to have those conversations early. And
Oh,
if I'd,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, sorry, just to add to that, there's
Mm,
a lot, obviously, even if we just go back to what you said about individualized care. And, for some individuals, maybe they don't want to discuss the broader aspects of birth earlier on in the pregnancy,
totally.
but it is about the individual. We should be guided by individuals and not hospital policies. And
Yep.
I had a really great conversation. The government are reviewing pregnancy care guidelines at the moment. And as part of those guidelines, they're also creating resources for consumers. And this particular resource that I was reviewing earlier this week, really great conversation. But on these resources, it talks at 20, between 20 weeks and 24 weeks. We'll be talking about, screening that you may want to get done, X, Y, Z.
Yep.
But in none of these, up until I think it was 36 weeks, there was no conversation around birthing preferences, birthing options, risks and benefits, looking at your risk profile. Because, I've learned so much from you in conversations we've had prior, and maybe we can touch briefly on that about, I can't ever pronounce it, Annie, uh, the Dandas syndrome.
Oh, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I don't even
Thank you.
pronounce it like some people
Yeah.
do. Everyone says it
Okay.
differently.
Okay, you make me feel better. But these comorbidities of conditions that we don't really have awareness about, these are conditions that we should be talking about much
Mhm.
earlier on than, only discovering afterwards that, hang on a minute, I'm hypermobile. So that really could have been a factor to a risk factor that I could end up with pelvic floor dysfunction. Why are we not talking about it
Oh,
still?
100%. And
You know?
like, so
Yeah.
EDS, for anyone who doesn't know, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is a connective tissue disorder,
Mm,
highly co-occurring in both autistic and ADHDers.
mm.
And we have bendy brains and bodies.
Mm. Oh, I
And
love
you,
that. You've not
yeah,
said that to me before, and I love it.
no.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
you don't have to be hypermobile. EDS, there's like 13, probably more types by now.
Mm,
But hypermobile EDS is the most common. So it's like
mm,
90% of EDSs are hypermobile EDS. But
mm,
essentially, connective tissue affects every part of your body. Like, I have currently got a bruised tailbone because I've recently started working in a co-working space, not just from home anymore. I
mm.
ventured out in the world after 5 years, and
Amazing.
I'm sitting up more on a chair.
Yeah.
And because I have dodgy connective tissue, my tailbone is very angry. Like, it
Mm,
affects literally every part of our lives,
mm,
very much our joints, very much our pelvic floor. And then if we even talk about like, so what happens often is, and without getting into it too much, I guess, is our body tends to compensate. So because we have like joint laxity and that sort of thing, our fascia and everything can get super tight. So I
mm.
have an overly active pelvic floor, so
Yeah.
like vaginismus, which obviously was going to play a part in trying to
Uh,
have a vaginal birth.
yeah.
Very common because we're like, there's not much stability down there. So we're trying to compensate by holding. And that's not talked about. And so it's like, when you get someone coming in saying, I'm neurodivergent, your first thought should be like, what other co-occurring conditions do you have? Do you have
Mm,
EDS? Do you have
mm.
hypermobility? Do you have anything else? A lot of us have PMDD, a PCOS, fibromyalgia. There's so many things that are more common in the neurodivergent space
I
that
mean, when
should
we,
be considered.
yeah, yeah, we could go off on a massive tangent on this because I do think it's
100%.
really important. These conditions are little known about. I don't think, again, when we just take one element of birth-related trauma, which can be pelvic floor muscle dysfunction. We should be screening for that in the ways that we are able to. And like you say, perhaps neurodivergency is a red flag. And that's part of the reason we as an organization really advocate for pelvic health physios to be involved in antenatal education as well as postnatal support. But that's a privilege, I guess, if you can access a private physio. But they are so well placed to talk about these functionalities or
Totally.
your
And
risk
check them
profile.
and know, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, risk
and
profile.
your risk profile of potentially, having some barriers to a physiological birth. And these
Totally.
are these are factors that are really missed. And again, it sort of points to the fact that, in the birth trauma inquiry alone, 4,000 submissions. And one of the key findings was that a one size fits all approach does not suit, the New South Wales demographic. It doesn't suit anybody, but
Nope.
we are still very much focused, seems to be very much focused on a one size fits all approach to birth without looking at a true risk profile of women. And I think maybe that is due for an update, because when we look at risk, we are certainly not looking at their prior their prior trauma history. We're not looking at neurodivergent individuals.
Mhm.
So I think there's something that could be explored there.
Yeah, their history with pelvic floor and
Yeah.
continency and all of those things, that
Yes. Yeah.
knowing those things in advance would help make more informed decisions by the medical
Mm,
care team and the individual, so that we can
mm,
reduce proper physical birth trauma, let alone
mm.
psychological birth trauma,
Mm, mm.
hugely.
Yes, it is. We always say it's not always preventable, but hey, one of the ways is education, not just for birthing parents, women and birthing parents, but for our care providers as well. Like there's some real gaps here, and we really need things to be updated and looking at the profile of society, which is it's just not being done really.
Totally,
So
totally.
yeah. So in terms of I guess like if you wanted to give a bit of advice to neurodivergent parents about advocating for their needs during pregnancy, birth, and the postnatal period, what would it be? What are some
Yep.
nuggets of advice if somebody's listening to this?
So, I mean, this is my one of my favorite areas,
Yeah,
teaching neurodivergent people to
yeah,
self-advocate. Not that we should have
yeah,
to, because if systems worked, then it wouldn't be a thing. So,
yeah,
happy
yeah.
to be not needing to do that anymore if our society can catch up. But in the meantime, it's all about making sure you're protected.
Mm,
It's like my number one thing is just knowing that your needs are valid, no matter
mm,
how much anyone else tells you they're not, because that's a huge problem, like I said earlier. But I
mm,
think, identify and communicate your needs as early as possible, not only like to help your whole care team, but also so you can test the waters on who are your allies in this
mm,
space. And like for
mm.
me, I'm really glad that I did try to do that at 20 weeks, because it
Yeah.
did allow me to speak up then and make sure I had a better obstetrician early on. If I hadn't have said that and he ended up in the delivery room with me and ignored me, can you imagine my own birth
Mm,
trauma?
mm,
So, speak up early, try to identify needs early. You don't have to be an expert in neurodivergence. Many of us, when we are late diagnosed, we deep dive into learning all about it and ourselves. And it's a lot. Like you've got to go
mm,
through a lifetime of trauma and a
mm.
lifetime of thinking you were a certain way and unpacking
And the
that,
gaslighting, the
and the
gaslighting that you
gaslighting.
said.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and unpacking your own internalized ableism, which we all have, and what is neuronormativity and all of that stuff. But you're not alone. Finding either advocates like myself, shameless plug, but also communities that you can, that are in similar places to you, that you can feel safe to ask advice on how to
Mm,
articulate things, or whether it's something that has affected others. Using scripts and templates is a big one for me. I give scripts to my NeuroAccess network community all the time. Having pre-prepared phrases for advocating can really not only reduce anxiety, but make sure that your message is getting across clearly in periods where you're in a heightened state, which is usually when
mm,
they're needed most.
mm,
Um, making sure that you are requesting reasonable adjustments. And also, I mean, I talk about on the self advocacy scale, I
mm,
talk about starting down in like the preference area to test the waters. If you're saying it's
mm,
a preference and it's getting taken seriously, that's great. If you're saying it's a preference and it's not, you know that they're going to be more difficult to get on
mm,
board, but you might need to
mm,
step it up into, this is actually an access need for me. Like
mm.
if I was a
Love
person
that.
in a wheelchair giving birth, you would have to take that into consideration. Well, I am a neurodivergent person giving birth. Excuse me.
Mm,
I'm a neurodivergent person giving birth, and this is my access need. And the
mm,
hard part with that is that, if you're in a wheelchair and like all the time, not ambulatory, but it's all or nothing, right? It's I cannot ever walk.
yeah.
Whereas if you're neurodivergent, often there will be periods where you can tolerate high sensory input. Sometimes you even seek it. You can communicate quite articulately. like they're all these traits that we've talked about, all these things that come up for us, the challenges, they fluctuate on a
Mm,
daily, minute by minute basis. And
mm.
that can make it really hard to be taken seriously, but also to articulate it. And so when
And
you
to
think,
advocate for yourself, because
and
you're
to
like,
advocate for
well,
yourself,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And also
yeah.
like you're advocating like throughout your pregnancy, you're trying to get to a point where you know that when you're in the birthing suite, when you're in theater, whatever, you are going to be dysregulated, like
Mm,
regardless of how many accommodations you have. So if you can get in early to try and make sure that you've got a team there who is aware of all of that and knows how to help, that's critical. But like
mm,
always, if you can have a support person with you, who can also advocate for you, that you can hand your advocacy birth plan to and say, these are all my preferences. This is how I feel about the things that I don't want to happen, but acknowledge might have to happen. This is
mm.
how I want to be communicated with. You know, this is what I'm going to need. I mean, we know that if you're going through a like natural vaginal delivery, maybe not induced, the least stressed you can be, the better. Like the more
Yeah,
the body
yeah,
will hopefully smoothly go through that transition.
yeah.
The more we add stress to the body, the worse that's going to be. So essentially, all of these reasonable adjustments and accessibility needs are reducing that stress so that you
Mm.
can have
The
hopefully a
birth you
positive
want. Yeah,
experience. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's really powerful. And I think just curiously, do you have some of these templates? Are they available on your website?
They're not
Is that
because I'm
something that we could
terrible at my
include?
website.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
um, but we can include it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that'd be
Well,
great. Yeah,
the PDF I've developed with for you guys,
yeah.
I can put scripts in that if that works, and then
Yeah,
people
yeah.
can
Well,
access them.
yeah, I should note. So, anyone listening, this I didn't say this at the start, but part of the reason, the driver for this conversation is next week is Neurodiversity Celebration Week, and we did want to do this. We've wanted to do this for a long time, but we will be releasing a resource that Annie has created for us, and we're really excited to share it with our community. But yeah, I think some templates maybe because that's when we started developing think natal education for women and birthing parents
Yeah.
around topics that are typically underrepresented in antenatal education. Part of those resources sort of talks to what you were saying before, Annie, about having multiple ways in which people can gather that information. So we have like a sort of easy accessible video that's a minute and a half long. We have downloadable resource with talking points that people can take to guide them when they're having conversations with their care
Amazing.
provider. And then we have a poster that we want care providers to actually have in their workplaces so that not only can women and parents look at that, but again, it's a learning tool to upskill those care providers to go, hey, the
Yes.
consumers want to know about this. So I think it'd be great to collaborate on some additional resources for the
Definitely.
community.
Definitely.
Yeah,
And I actually wanted to take that PDF that I've made, the guide, and I want to make an easy read version. I'm
yeah,
just sort of starting to get into being able to create easy read resources, but
mm,
a lot of people think, easy read used to be thought of as something that is needed for like intellectual disability, but it actually helps a lot of neurodivergence more
mm,
broadly to break down complex things. Or if you're dyslexic and reading is not your thing, then
mm.
it's much easier and that sort of thing. So we'll try and get an easy read version of that as well.
Mm.
But
And that
yeah,
would also
scripts are
support
great.
our multicultural community as well. We need,
Hugely. Yeah,
every
English as a
time
second language. Yeah.
every time I'm reviewing resources and you read the words and you're just like, okay, I'm trying to wear this with a lens of if English wasn't my second language or I
Or
potentially didn't
even
have
if
that
you didn't know
education that I
medical
have. Yeah.
language and such. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think that there's still a lot of work there to be
Yeah,
done in the medical space. I
totally.
think it would be really good to end this conversation on if there was one thing, and that's going to be really hard because there's
So
obviously a million,
hard.
but if there was one thing you could change in maternity care to better support neurodivergent parents, what would it
Yeah.
be?
Well, I would say the ditching the one size fits all care, but you
Mm,
already advocate for that beautifully. And I think we've already talked about that. So I'm going to say mandatory neurodiversity training in
nice.
maternity care for all of them,
Yeah.
for OBs, for nurses, for midwives, everyone who touches a person in the maternity journey should
Mm,
have mandatory neurodiversity training.
love
Like,
that.
I wish
We can
that
get
that was
behind that.
standardized. Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll
and
develop that.
it is, yeah,
Yeah,
watch
it
this
needs to
space.
happen. Mm.
It is anyone because when we, obviously, we expanded to say birth-related trauma because the people we support have experienced events in their journey to parenthood, and that can be from conception through pregnancy, through labor and birth, postnatal experience, and beyond. And so you want all of those care providers to be able to wear a lens
Yeah,
that respects and understands the complexities of working with neurodivergent parents, just like they need to know about working with migrant parents or parents from the LG.
BTQ plus. Yeah,
Thank you.
that's okay.
Brain's not working today. You
Tongue
talked
tie.
about PMDD earlier. We'll
We
maybe do
did.
something about that another day. But
Yes.
it is about working with a broader society, and it is people like you, Annie, that gets the word out there that helps certainly me learn, but also hopefully the care providers that are supporting parents in this space as well. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
I
Thanks
will
for having me
share
on.
your details on the video once it's published, and I'm excited to bring this to the community. Thanks so much for your time.
Anytime. I love talking to you. And I'm just so happy that you're so invested in so many diverse communities that
Mm,
is so needed. Like, yeah, I'm a huge
yeah,
supporter of ABTA.
thank you. And I'm sure
Yeah,
we'll have another conversation soon. So thanks so
definitely.
much.
You're welcome.
Okay.